At 6:47 on November 3, 1944, a low November light filtered through the shattered windows of a ruined bakery in the outskirts of Aachen, and Michael Donovan had his eye pressed to a scope while time measured itself in held breaths. He felt the cold through the butt of his rifle, tasted iron at the back of his throat from 2 nights with too little sleep, and waited, because waiting was the only useful thing left to do until something moved. Outside, the city smelled of smoke and damp plaster. Inside the hide, a map of plaster dust lay under his fingers, and the tick of a pocket watch set the tempo for a man who had to notice everything and miss nothing. If this story matters to you, stick around. Like, subscribe, and share to help bring forgotten makers and field fixes back into the conversation. They had lost too many men to the same problem. The Germans had learned, within weeks, to use what the Americans called a double position around likely sniper nests. While one rifle kept a narrow cone of fire from a fixed point, a second soldier moved unseen along an adjacent approach and cut off the rear or flank. In practice, it meant that a sniper who lived by the scope's tunnel vision could be flanked within the space of a single heartbeat. Scope magnification, Donovan thought, was both blessing and curse. An 8x optic gave a distant target with frightening clarity, but confined the eye to a cylinder of vision, like looking through a paper tube. That tunnel let them pick off men, but it also made them blind to what happened a few degrees to the left or right. Donovan had watched 2 partners die because of that blindness. James Bradley, a farm boy who whistled under his breath and chewed tobacco when nerves got bad, had taken a round that grazed the temple while Bradley's mate called for the shot. Then silence. Robert Chen, steady, methodical, who kept a small watercolor of his younger sister tucked in the buttstock, had been hit while checking an approach he could not afford to check. Sam Martinez, younger than his rank warranted, had lived with a wound that thinned his voice and sharpened the way he looked at Donovan. Those losses were not abstractions. They sat at the back of Donovan's skull like cold lead. He learned the geometry of absence and said it aloud sometimes in the dark. We can't keep losing men like this. He was not an inventor by trade. He was the kind of man the Army had sorted into snipers because he could hold still for hours and count the movements of leaves. But he had a machinist's patience, a boyhood spent fixing tractors, and a hands-on comfort with metal and glue that came from being the one who could make broken things work again. The idea, when it came, arrived not as a thunderbolt, but as the small, practical logic of someone trying to survive another dawn. If the scope narrowed his view, then augment the view. Peripheral vision had to be taken from elsewhere. The shaving mirror had been in a canvas ration pack, a small convex disc meant to give fellows a way to clean up in a ruined hotel or a makeshift billet. It was an ordinary thing, silvered glass in a leather frame, slightly tarnished, its back worn by other hands. Donovan turned it over in his hands, feeling how light threw off the curve. He remembered hunting with his father, and how on a crooked winter hill they had used a strip of tin to look around a stump without exposing a head. That memory collided with the recent deaths and the arithmetic of angles. He worked in the half-lights between patrols, using what the field offered. The tools were improvised. A small jeweler's file scavenged from an equipment box, a shard of brass pried from the fittings of a wrecked bicycle, a length of waxed twine, and a smear of varnish. He cut the mirror down so its face would sit flush against the metal housing of his scope without intruding into the objective lens. He needed it to present a patch of peripheral image at a slant, not a reflection of the target ahead, but a slice of what lay to the side. He fitted a thin brass strip as a tiny bracket, hammered and filed until it took a right angle, and secured the assembly with a dab of resin and a wrap of cloth tape that smelled faintly of oil. The mirror settled at roughly 30 degrees off the scope's axis, low enough not to show the reticle, but high enough to give a glance when his eye slid just slightly left. It was crude and delicate both.
He tested it behind sandbags on a cold morning, breathing in measured draws against the smell of cordite and wet wool. The first time he shifted his eye and saw another alley reflected, his chest loosened. For the first time he could scan the flank without breaking position. It did not remove risk, it altered the geometry of it. Where before a man could appear from the blind cone and close distance unnoticed, now Donovan could see the shadow move a fraction earlier, adjust his angle, call for covering fire, or tilt and withdraw. The small disk had introduced a new variable into a deadly calculus. His first field trial was not a dramatized success. On November 7th, with frost like paper on the air and the remains of a cathedral shadowed against the east, Donovan and Bradley anchored in a bakery loft to watch a crossroads where Wehrmacht patrols wound their way like slow beetles. Donovan's pulse had been a steady metronome. Bradley had a cigarette he kept cupping because the tinder was precious. At 09:18, a boot scraped on rubble across the street, and Donovan's scope picked up the familiar uniform. He saw, too, the thin vertical shape in the reflection, a second man moving along the flank. He whispered the warning. Bradley swiveled and laid down a burst that put the second man out of action before he could close. It was not cinematic. The engagement lasted seconds, measured as heartbeats. A man lived because they bought 2 seconds' notice. Word traveled the way it always had in the war, slowly and then like wildfire. Sergeant Frank Wilson noticed it first, in the exchange of kit and gossip over ration coffee. Wilson had been a hunter before the war, a man who had taught Donovan how to strip a bolt silently and how to listen for the particular cadence of a town when tanks passed. He examined the little mirror with that keen practical eye soldiers learn in the field. "About time somebody thought sideways," he said, and then he helped. Together they adapted the bracket to another rifle, using a slightly different angle for a shorter-barreled carbine that would otherwise have cramped the field of view. What began as Donovan's private modification became, in the breathing spaces between raids, a shared solution. Adoption followed the simplest logic. It saved men. Within 2 weeks, in skirmishes and ambushes around Aachen, teams using the mirror reported fewer casualties and a marked reduction in flank incursions. Before the mirror, across a series of 8 documented sniper deployments in late October and early November, the battalion had recorded 7 casualties attributed to flanking tactics, 3 fatal. After diffusion of the mirror among the company snipers, in 12 similar deployments across the following month, the same battalion recorded no fatal sniper casualties and a significant drop in flank penetration incidents, roughly a 70% decrease by the unit's crude counts. These numbers did not mean the mirror was perfect. It meant objectives could be held with fewer men lost and that teams could choose to live to fight another day. For Donovan, that margin between losing and keeping a friend had become all that mattered. Donovan's hands remembered the geometry even when he tried not to think about it. He would set up, tape the mirror, check the light, and then let memory tide over him. Bradley's whistle, Chen's watercolor, the way Martinez held his breath when a mortar fell too close. Those ghosts sat like stones in his chest. Sometimes he would press the mirror until the adhesive creaked, as if that small mechanical sound could anchor him to the living. The innovation did not go unnoticed forever. A patrol captain, Robert Hayes, came through the line on November 22nd, reviewing positions and listening to the small reports of the men. Hayes was the kind of officer whom had been hardened and then softened by command. He understood regulations, but he understood survival even more. He watched Donovan demonstrate the mirror behind a windowsill and then sat back and let the logic of it sink in. Hayes did not make a speech. He took the sheet of notes some ordnance men might later call a report, and he protected the field fix. "We don't publish more problems than we fix," he told Donovan in a voice that tried to be both officer and fellow man. "But mark it down. We'll show it to the ordnance team when they come through." When the evaluation team arrived at the end of November, they treated the mirror less as a novelty and more as an engineering problem. Could this be standardized, hardened, issued? The ordnance officers measured angles and field of view, calculated the practicalities of mounting a reflective peripheral on different scopes, and wrote recommendations. They took rubbings of the bracket and included a sketch in a report that later circled back through channels. The fix was documented, and by the time the official papers left the theater, a recommendation existed for a prototype mount. But names are slippery in bureaucratic documents. Field inventors often appear as anonymous source or field report, rather than as the men who smuggled ideas into life. Donovan's name appeared in a handwritten margin of Hayes' notes, a small acknowledgement that circled like a ghost through the files. But when the final ordnance memorandum reached a regiment headquarters, the credit had migrated into the passive voice. A peripheral mirror device was field-tested and recommended. Donovan had not wanted credit in any formal sense. He had wanted, in the plain language he used for sleep and survival, to stop losing man. In conversations afterward, when Sergeant Wilson pressed him, "You should put in for a commendation, Michael," he would only shake his head. "I did what I had to," he said. "If others get the idea and live, that's enough." Yet there was a quiet resentment in some of his own that outlived his words. The way Sam Martinez, when he recovered enough to walk with a cane, would squeeze Donovan's hand and say thank you in a way that made Donovan's throat ache. The way Bradley's mother later sent a small folded letter that Donovan kept under the varnish in the stock as if the paper might steady the wood. The mirror became a small emblem of the field's improvisatory ingenuity. Men trade fixes the way they trade tobacco and stories, in the dark, from hand to hand. Sergeant Wilson and a couple of other senior noncoms improvised a simple kit for mounting that could be fitted in the field in under 20 minutes with minimal materials. Within a month, in the compass of the battalion, nearly every sniper had some form of peripheral patch, some crude mirror, some polished metal, some small convex disc scrounged from shaving kits or binocular housings. The effect was measurable in reports and palpable in the men's faces, a less tight, tremulous expression when a shadow passed. But the institutional arc was not without its own gravity. The ordnance team returned with blueprints and a recommendation for a factory-produced mount. They wrote for standardization and safety. They wrote because the Army, like every large machine, required that innovations be smoothed and authorized before they entered the supply chain. There were practical reasons. A field-made mirror could fall off at a critical moment or shatter in a rain of shrapnel. Formal adoption meant reproducible, ruggedized mounts. Captain Hayes worked to protect the makers in his command. He sent a note up the line asserting that the fix had been field-developed and recommending nominal commendations for the teams. The paper trail widened. And then, as so often happens, the story of who did what narrowed. In later official minutes, the device became, in the language of committees, an external peripheral reflector developed in theater. The ordnance report listed the unit and the date, and a photograph showed a rifle with a cleanly manufactured bracket and a commercial-looking reflective plate, professional and anonymous. When an article in a small technical journal ran months later, it used the same photograph and thanked Field Reports. Donovan's name did not appear. Hayes's margin scribble remained folded in a pocket file. The author of the technical note wrote to describe the device in precise terms and, in doing so, made the people who had birthed it recede into the phrase field-tested. It was not malice, as Donovan and his circle told each other. It was the way organizations translate improvisation into policy, smoothing edges, assigning responsibility to committees, and in the act of making something reproducible, effacing the messy seam where a man with a file and a strip of brass turned necessity into invention. Donovan accepted the erasure the way he accepted Winters, as something elemental. He did not pursue recognition aggressively. His absence from print did not mean his hands had not built the thing. It meant, painfully, that the world that mattered to historians and later reporters would have to look harder. The price of survival and the price of anonymity exist on the same ledger in war. Donovan kept quiet, in part because he believed in the work's utility and not its glory. In part, too, there was a private calculus of unheroic humility. The men he loved were alive, and that mattered more than ribbons or press clippings. He measured his life in letters from Sam Martinez, who, years after, would write that he still checked the left flank with a gesture he learned in those months, and in the faded watercolor of Chen's sister tucked in a trunk that Donovan kept in the back of his locker, a small testimony that let him remember without needing an audience. Years after the engagement, long after the smoke cleared and the ordnance reports were bound into archives, a historian named Elise Corbett found herself following a thin trail of marginal notes. Corbett spent the better part of a decade chasing the footpaths of small innovations, field fixes that sat like shards under thicker narratives of strategy and grand battles. When she pieced together Hayes's margin, interviews with survivors, and a brittle photograph of a rifle,
With a cleanly fabricated bracket, she saw the outline of a story erased by institutional smoothing. She sought out survivors in veterans' hospitals and small towns, tracking down Sam Martinez in a modest home where he kept the mirror in a cigar box alongside a fold of birthday cards. He had kept one of Donovan's crude mirrors, its edge worn and the cloth tape darkened with age. Corbett's careful work, oral histories, archived reports, a cross-referenced set of deployment logs, reconstituted Donovan's name in a way official documents had not. She wrote an article for a journal of military history and later helped an exhibit at a regional museum acquire one of Donovan's surviving mirrors and a photograph of the bracket. The exhibit did not rewrite ordnance bureaucracy. It offered a counterpoint, a small placard that read simply that a field modification developed by a named man, Michael Donovan, had demonstrably reduced sniper fatalities in late 1944 and merited recognition. The museum case became the formal place where the mirror shifted from mere tool to symbol. Visitors leaned close to the glass and read the placard, and sometimes a veteran in a cardigans came by and pressed a thumb against the cool barrier and told a volunteer a story about a friend who had been lucky. For Donovan's surviving comrades, the display was less about institutional correction and more about a simple act of remembrance. Sam Martinez wrote to Corbett once, thanking her, and enclosed a photograph of a wreath he had placed at a small gravestone where Bradley's name slanted in the damp earth. He would have liked the coffee, Sam wrote, and the sentence carried the shape of all the things that public recognition could not quite replace. Even so, the archival record retained its own ambivalence. Some official records continued to use the passive grays of field-tested and recommended, while personal letters and museum captions leaned into names and human hands. Donovan's name circulated in a narrower world: survivors' reunions, small-town obituaries, a single local paper that published his portrait in the margins of a Veterans Day piece. He never sought out debate with ordnance officers or demanded a public vindication. He lived with the knowledge that what mattered most had been done. Men lived, and that, for him, was recompense enough. There were nights when ghosts returned in different shapes. Donovan would wake sometimes and hear the sound of a shoe on plank, half remembering a street and half remembering the hollow voice of a man who had not completed a sentence. He walked through years with a small, private archive of artifacts: the varnished stock, the letter from Bradley's mother, a small smear of resin and cloth tape that had once held a mirror steadfast against rain and recoil. He kept those things like a cartographer keeps margins. They told him where he had been. For those who studied the war later, the mirror offered a lesson about the moral geography of innovation, that the things which save lives may arrive
from the humblest origins, and that institutional memory can be both preservative and erasing. Corbett's work opened a conversation. Museums began to accept more of the little things, field-modified triggers, patched helmets, sets of hand-tooled brackets, objects that could not be reduced to bullet points in ordnance manuals. They circulated among historians and public audiences as evidence that wars are not won only by grand designs, but by 1,000 small acts of remedy. And yet, the mirror symbolism contained a stubborn ambiguity. It was at once a triumph of lateral thinking and a reminder of how easily human contribution is subsumed under organizational verbs: standardized, issued, recommended. In a photograph taken for the museum, the mirror's glass caught a sliver of window light and threw it back like a small promise. The caption read, in modest but steady type, that the device had been field improvised by Michael Donovan and had demonstrably reduced fatalities in sniping operations during November 1944. For a handful of men sitting in folding chairs at a dedication ceremony, the caption read like the small, belated vindication of a life spent doing what needed to be done. Donovan attended the small unveiling with a silence that suited him. He stood at the back, hands in the pockets of a jacket that had grown thin at the seams, and watched as a volunteer described the device's geometry. He did not say much afterward. Sam Martinez hugged him, and in that embrace Donovan felt the imprecision of public recognition. It was not the same as a medal or a headline, but it was something inward and immediate, the kind of human response that tightened a knot in his chest and then let it go. Years later, when Corbett published a longer account that threaded archive documents with oral histories, the military historian community debated the nature of attribution and the moral weight of institutional amnesia. In academic footnotes, they argued about methodology and the danger of romanticizing improvisation. Veterans read the piece with different eyes. Some with an ironic, rueful smile at the way the Army's paperwork swallowed names, others with a small, fierce gratitude that a man they had known was finally named in public. For Donovan, recognition was never the end. The mirror had done its work. Men had lived. He had learned, in the long arithmetic of survival and memory, that being named in a journal or etched onto a placard did not remove the landscape of loss. It did, however, let his hands rest in the world a little more easily. He kept walking the ways he always had, visiting graves, writing a letter now and then to a friend, leaning over the varnish of his gun and feeling the old resin like a line drawn across the years. When he died, quietly in the company of a few friends and the steady ticking of a clock, the obituary in the local paper mentioned his service, his small-town beginnings, and a line about ingenuity in the field. It did not saturate the headline, but it placed a name where there had been once only an anonymous fix. Survivors called each other and told stories at a cafe table, and a younger man, whose uncle had served with Donovan, walked into the museum and stood before the glass where a taped mirror lay like a tiny moon. He read the placard and then looked up at the photograph of Donovan, in his mid-30s, eyes steady under a brimmed cap. The mirror had survived as an object and as a symbol, because people cared enough to remember. That care came in uneven doses. A curator who wanted the artifact, a historian who followed a margin, a sergeant who defended a field fix with his rank. It also came in quieter ways. Letters to widows, a small group of men who met once a year and told the same story until the cadence of it carried both grief and gratitude. In the end, the most honest accounting of Donovan's life was less about pages or plaques and more about small returns. A man who had seen a problem and, with simple tools and a stubborn refusal to accept routine loss, had pushed the margins of survival outward by inches. The mirror reflected, in the barest sense, a sideways way of seeing and a sideways way of caring. It taught that ingenuity often looks like bricolage. A strip of brass, a worn shaving glass, the steady hand of a man who had learned to look not only forward through a reticle, but sideways where danger lurked. The story did not tidy itself into a happy moral. There remained, as there always does, the ache for the men who had not come home and the knowledge that institutions flatten names into policy. But there was also, stubborn and luminous, the fact of lives extended, years of grandchildren, letters from men who had been saved, a handful of medals that sat in drawers, and a mirror in a museum case that caught the light of visitors who bent close enough to see. Those small acts of remembrance roused a kind of public humility, a willingness to ask where and to whom credit belonged. When a young researcher years later asked why Donovan had not pressed harder for his name to appear in the ordnance reports, a veteran who had served under Hayes answered simply, he didn't need the paper, he needed the men. That answer sat in the room like a steadying thing. It was not the only answer, but it was the truest for those who had watched Donovan work in the cold gutters and testified to the lives he had altered. The mirror, in its tiny reflective arc, remained the story's small, stubborn core, a plain object that bent light and fate, that let a man see an invisible approach and give another man time to live. It taught, finally, that innovation in war is made in the margins, by hands that know how.
To file metal, and by people who measure worth not in medals, but in the slow accounting of survivors. The city outside the museum's windows changed over the decades. The bakery where Donovan had first used the mirror became a cafe, and the plaster dust that had meant danger was now a backdrop for pastry boxes and neutral conversations. Inside, under glass, the mirror waited for the occasional visitor who would lean in and, with an honest curiosity, ask the simple question, who did this? The answer, when it came, softened the edges of bureaucratic language and put a name to a small, consequential act. There was more to record, the technical notes Corbett found in an appendix, the oral testimonies that added texture to dates, the quiet letters sent to families. But the core of the matter lay already plain. A man, a mirror, a death avoided, a name reclaimed. The rest of the story would be how the memory carried forward, who remembered and how, and whether small ingenuity would be protected instead of smoothed into anonymous compliance. For Donovan and those who had stood under a lean-to and taped glass to a scope, it was enough that a few people finally spoke the name out loud, and that the museum glass caught the light in the same way the mirror had once caught a sliver of a street. A few weeks after the researcher left the museum, the nephew went back to the cafe that had replaced the bakery. He carried with him a thin envelope, the sort that meant more than a casual visit. A copy of the photograph, a Xerox of the placard, a note in a hand he had never seen before. The man who ran the cafe remembered Donovan's face from the photograph. There were customers who had known the story and customers who arrived curious. And between the steam of espresso and the clink of spoons, the old accounts found new listeners. The nephew unfolded the note across the table. It had been sent by a woman who signed herself as M. Hayes. She described a borrowed mirror once, a borrowed soldering iron, a field fix in a rain that smelled like metal and old winters. She wrote that Donovan had come to the makeshift shop one dusk with hands full of small brass shavings and a confidence that seemed to belong to another life. He didn't want to be remembered, she wrote, but he wanted the men to come home. That letter made its way to the museum curator, who read it twice and then locked it in a drawer with gentle, deliberate movement, as if it were itself the object. Corbett, who had delivered papers and appendices to audiences that usually preferred tidy footnotes to messy human things, began to think of the margins he had excised. He turned the appendix he had found, digital schematics, scrawled measurements, a list of parts with slanted script, into an exhibit note. He allowed Donovan's name to stand not idle.
When he did so, but as a heading. When he did so, veterans who had been reluctant to speak felt permission to step forward. At the next anniversary meeting, one of those yearly gatherings where men told the same stories to remind themselves they were still in possession of certain truths, Hayes stood and said what the young researcher had asked of others quietly before. Why had Donovan never filed a claim for credit? Hayes's voice was slow and precise. He thought the problem belonged to whoever was wearing the scarf that night, he said. He never meant to be a headline. A few people laughed, but their laughs were small and edged with relief. Names were spoken that afternoon the way one polishes a lens, carefully, with attention. Donovan's name settled into the cadence of the room like a note that had been absent and was now found. News of the Mirror's display drifted, too, into places that did not keep careful minutes. A private email between two instructors at a disposal school, a footnote in a trade magazine's online column, a fax that became a photocopy passed among a small circle of hands that measured risk for a living. The idea of an inexpensive, field-adaptable reflective aid appealed to those who had to make do with what was at hand. It did not become doctrine overnight, innovations rarely do, but it seeded practice in the shadowed corners where improvisation was the currency. More moving than any ripple across institutions were the private reckonings. A widow who had kept a drawer full of uncashed letters received a phone call from a man who had once been given a second of safety because of a taped glass. He spoke haltingly, struggling to convey the way an otherwise ordinary day had changed the course of his life. The widow listened, and then, months later, she came to the museum with a small box. Inside lay a ribbon, a photograph, and, folded carefully, a sheet Donovan had once used to wipe his hands. The curator accepted the gift with a hand that trembled slightly, and placed it, later, beside the mirror. On a rainy afternoon, when the city outside the museum was a gray wash and the cafe windows blurred with condensation, a child pressed her forehead against the display glass and peered at the mirror. Her mother explained, in a voice that turned history into story. There was a man who saw differently, and because he saw, others lived. The child tapped the glass, delighted by the small circle of reflected light. For the child, the object became less an artifact than a promise. That small things mattered. None of this erased the bureaucratic flattening that had once swallowed names into reports. There were still official memos that used phrases, procedural anomaly, incident mitigation, and papers that tried to quantify lives in statistics. But those impersonal documents sat beside a more stubborn ledger kept in living memory. Letters sent to families, a plaque with a name, a mirror that
caught and returned light. That ledger required no signature from a committee to be true. And so the mirror continued to perform its quiet duty. People bent close to see it, and when they did, they found themselves asking questions. Those questions returned names to sentences. They nudged faded letters into daylight. They made patchwork innovations respectable again, at least in the small ways that matter. A soldier passing on a scrap of brass to a comrade, an instructor showing a trainee how to tape a shard of mirror to an optic, a widow teaching a grandchild how to remember without making spectacle of sorrow. In the archives, someone, Corbett perhaps, or the young researcher himself, penned a paragraph that read like a concession. That history is not only made in committees, but also in lean toes and in the hands of men who keep working when no one is watching. The sentence was simple, stubborn, and true. It was the kind of line that historians underline and museum volunteers read aloud on slow afternoons. Outside the museum, the city moved on. But the mirror, strapped into its quiet cradle beneath the glass, took the light as it always had. And when the light found it, through a shaft of sun or a child's impatient finger, the mirror bent that light, just enough so someone else might see. The name that had waited for recognition washed for a moment across a face in the crowd. It warmed the air like a small private place where memory could be kept alive, not by policies or proclamations, but by the simple act of looking and choosing to remember. That evening, the museum stayed open a little later than usual. The lamps in the gallery threw warm ovals across the floor. Rain had stopped, and the street beyond the windows smelled of wet stone and exhaust. People came in pairs and alone, some with the uncertain solemnity of visitors to a grave, others with the easy curiosity of those for whom the word innovation opens conversations rather than wounds. The curator stood by the case, hands folded, accepting small offerings, a pressed flower, a scrap of typed note, a child's drawing of a shining circle. They arranged chairs in a rough semicircle in the space between the cases, and the curator, with a voice that tried on evenness and kept returning instead to feeling, invited those who had something to say. Corbett lingered at the back, the paragraph she'd written tucked into her breast pocket like a talisman. The young researcher sat near the front, palms folded as if in anticipation or apology. He looked younger than his name suggested, and older than the catalogue of his mistakes allowed. A man with a slow gait stood when the curator asked. He introduced himself as Ellis, and said only that he had been a corporal once, and that the mirror, that bit of glass, he called it, had sat on the dash of a vehicle when the rest of them thought only
of getting home. He described the morning they'd left a town behind, thick with smoke and a smell like old rope, how they'd stalled and how someone had thrown together a signal from a shard and tape. He did not claim heroics. He spoke in fragments that fit together into a picture anyway. An angle found, a volley that missed, a man who breathed when he did not have to. When he sat down, his hands trembled enough that the woman beside him handed him a paper cup of coffee. A widow read from a letter long folded, the edges soft with handling. It was addressed to Donovan, and it began, as many of those letters did, with a small domestic intimacy. "There's a leak in the kitchen," the writer told him, and then veered, as lives do, into weightier things. She read the lines slowly, as if untangling them aloud made the meaning more present. People listened as though they could hold the sentences between them and shield them from the small violences of forgetting. A teacher from the disposal school spoke about the practicality of improvisation, about how the mirror had become a listen in a class otherwise ruled by manuals. He did not romanticize scarcity. He said plainly that ingenuity is a discipline, and that the students who learn it do so because someone once trusted them with a scrap. When it came time for Corbett to speak, she walked to the center without announcing herself. The paragraph she'd written, the concession to the lean toes of history, felt insufficient beside so many lives. But words are what museums use to make durable the delicate. She read it once, and then read it again, and when she finished, someone in the back clapped softly. She did not claim to have restored Donovan's name single-handedly. What she said, instead, was that recognition is often a conversation, not a judgment. A conversation between those who keep records and those who keep watch, between paper and practice, between committees and the unremarked hands that learn to hold the world steady. After the formal remarks, people drifted closer to the glass. The child who had tapped the display earlier returned, now in a rain jacket that smelled faintly of orange peel, and peered at the mirror again. The young researcher moved to stand beside her, and when she looked up, he showed her how light bent on a small convex surface, how angles can hide and reveal. Her mother watched them, smiling, and then, quietly, the young researcher asked if anyone could tell him stories he had not yet heard. Voices rose in response, short, entreating, particular, about nights when a scrap changed a route, about a handkerchief wiped across a brow, about a joke told to break fear. Each anecdote returned the object to people, not an exhibit, but a thing that had once been handled and cursed and thanked. Near the end of the night, a woman in her 50s stood alone before the case. She did not speak at first. Then, with a steady hand, she opened her handbag and produced a small cloth, thin and faded, and unfolded it like an offering. On the cloth was a faint smudge that might have been oil, might have been the trace of someone's thumb. The curator took it reverently and held it up so others could see. No one asked whose it was. They assumed it was a domestic remnant, a piece of the ordinary that had brushed against the extraordinary. Later, when the gallery was emptying, the woman, Donovan's sister, as the curator had learned, approached the case and, without fanfare, pressed the cloth to the glass beside the mirror. She did not expect it to stick. She did not expect anything at all, except perhaps a moment of alignment between an object and a family. Outside, the city continued. Maps of policy drafts and committee minutes were being assembled in offices that smelled of printer ink and late-night coffee. Somewhere, a contractor filed a handwritten note into a folder marked Standardization. The pragmatic machinery of adoption grinds slowly and does not always keep pace with stories. But the ripples from the museum found other shores. An instructor wrote to a colleague across the sea with directions for attaching a small mirror to a shoulder strap. A retired engineer sketched on the back of an envelope a suggestion for a casing that would protect a reflective panel from dust. A young apprentice tried the technique on a training course and, months later, emailed a short message that read simply, "It worked." The young researcher received many of those messages. He read them at his kitchen table. The pages spread like small maps. He made lists, not of credit, but of contacts. People who had adapted the idea, who had argued about materials, who had sent diagrams in quickly photographed frames. He began to collect the fragments because it was a way to show that the object had been more than an inspiration. It had been a practice. It was, he realized, the difference between a good story and a living craft. Corbett kept visiting the museum. She would stand in front of the mirror until the reflection blurred into something else, a face, a memory, a question about how one name becomes many. Once, late, she found the curator asleep in a narrow office, a mug cooling beside a pile of accession forms. The curator woke with a start, apologetic, and Corbett laughed softly. It was the kind of laugh that speaks both of fatigue and of a gratitude that has grown used to being private. Not everyone who came to the gallery spoke. Some left messages instead. A child drew a picture of a circle that had rays like a sun and wrote in shaky letters for Donovan beneath it. An old friend wrote a note that began, "We were foolish and we were brave," and left it folded under the case. The museum staff mounted the letters, like stars in a small night, pinning them to a board for private viewing. The names proliferated, not to overwhelm Donovan, but to show the shape of lives sketched around a simple invention. Months later, an article appeared in a magazine that covered the lighter side of design, not the hard sciences, but the curious intersections where craft meets necessity. It told the story of the mirror in the tone of discovery, how a man with little fanfare had taped a thing in place, and, in doing so, altered how others navigated danger. The piece did not invent history, it reshaped attention. People who had never visited the museum now found themselves searching for images, for traces. The mirror, once hidden in the folds of improvised practice, had become a story people could hold when they considered what to do with the things they had. At home, Donovan's daughter kept a small photograph of him on her dresser. She had once resisted public recognition, fearing that a name enshrined on a plaque would be a way of saying goodbye rather than a way of keeping company. But at the museum, she had watched the way hands found room for a name, gentle, necessary, and she changed her mind. One afternoon, she brought the photograph, and when the gallery was nearly empty, she opened the case and, with the curator's permission, laid the photograph on the cloth beside the mirror. The mirror's roundness reflected the image back at her, multiplied. Donovan's eyes looking out with the same plain steadiness she remembered. The city's light caught at the corner of his mouth. She stood there until the gallery's bulbs warmed to evening, and when she left, she closed the door softly behind her, as if to leave a room unchanged yet better attended. Someone later would write that artifacts do not choose their meaning, people do. And perhaps that was true. The mirror had been what it had always been, an object that bent light. But the meanings refolded around it like paper, letters, muffled conversations, small inventions.
Donovan's name, once swallowed by reports and procedural language, had been given back the way gardeners return soil to a plant, not with one decisive action, but with many small ministrations. On a clear morning months after the opening, as a shaft of sunlight found the display and a tourist paused to take a photograph, the mirror caught the light and sent a sliver of it across the case. The ribbon on display fluttered from a draft of air. A child traced the outline of the reflected circle with her finger and giggled as the light slid away and then returned. In that moment, the museum felt less like an archive and more like a kind of vigil, one kept not by ordinance but by attention. The ledger of lives continued to be written, not in ink alone, but in the way people returned to the objects and the memories, in the way they told small truths until those truths
gathered into something that could be read by others. Day turned toward evening. The young researcher stayed longer than most, cataloging yet another set of notes that had arrived in his inbox. Diagrams, testimonies, a single-line message from someone in a field team. "We used it tonight. Thank you." He folded the papers and slid them into a folder marked in his handwriting, not with claim, but with purpose, for sharing. When the lights dimmed and the last visitor left, the mirror sat in its soft, protected light, and the photograph beside it kept Donovan's eyes bright for anyone who bent to look. Outside, the city breathed on, indifferent and hospitable both. Inside, a small constellation of moments, of letters and hands and folded cloths, continued to keep him company. The mirror waited, as it always had, for the light to come.